The shadow of an unannounced constitutional execution has descended upon the House of Windsor. Exactly 7 minutes ago, an official declaration was released from behind the locked gates of the palace, a statement no royal watcher believed could ever be written in our lifetime. Without a gradual transition, without a ceremonial farewell, and without a single moment allowed for private negotiation, the position of Queen Consort has been terminated with immediate effect. Camilla, who spent decades fighting through public hostility and frigid palace corridors to establish her place beside the king, has been systematically stripped of her sovereign standing. In her place, by extraordinary royal decree, stands Princess Anne, formally appointed to assume the duties beside the monarch. This was no mere rumor, no temporary disciplinary exile, and no decision open to appeal. It carried the unyielding weight of the official royal seal and the direct signature of King Charles III, executed in total secrecy long before the first light of dawn broke over London. Peering through the heavy mahogany doors of Clarence House, the devastating immediate aftermath reveals a household in quiet, agonizing collapse. Camilla sat at her desk, her manicured fingers tightening until her knuckles turned white around the parchment. She read the declaration once, then twice, her breathing shallow as the sharp reality sank in. When her private secretary entered the room, avoiding her eyes, her voice quivered with suppressed rage as she demanded why no one had warned her. The document bore an exact activation timestamp, proving that while she slept, her standing had been methodically dismantled. Across London at St. James's Palace, Princess Anne received the same communiqué. She remained standing as she read it, her face a mask of impenetrable discipline. Setting the document down without a sound, she told her aide that she had never asked to take another woman's place. Yet the Princess Royal understood the terrifying weight of the sovereign mandate. Duties beside the king were being transferred to his sister, leaving the marriage intact on paper while severing its institutional spine. One sentence in the statement cut deeper than any dagger. This administrative change is deemed necessary to protect the continuity, discipline, and credibility of the crown during internal instability. In the uncompromising language of the realm, the crown is an immortal institution whose authority rests entirely upon public trust. To Camilla, those words signaled raw humiliation and complete betrayal. To Anne, they sounded as a grave, unyielding summons to duty. And to King Charles III, sitting alone in his dimly lit study while urgent, unanswered knocks echoed against his door, they represented the horrific price of a treason he could no longer ignore. On the desk before him lay the gold fountain pen used to sign the decree before dawn. The king stared at the drying ink in utter silence, his hands still, trapped in the crushing realization that his own signature had undone the woman he had spent a lifetime defending against the world. The palace wording attempted to reduce the crisis to a mere technical shift in royal responsibilities, but no formal language could mask the personal devastation underneath. Beyond the title stood 3 figures, bound by blood, marriage, and an agonizing wound. Camilla had endured years of public rejection, treating the consort title as final proof that the monarchy had accepted her. Now, that proof had vanished in a single morning. Anne felt no victory in her sudden elevation. Decades of selfless service, military associations, and uncomplaining discipline had earned her the respect of the palatial elite. But in a closed-door meeting with Prince William, her tone burned with righteous disdain. "Duty cannot erase the cruelty of replacing someone within our own bloodline," she told him, her posture rigid as she stared out at the rain-swept courtyard. Yet the public statement revealed only the surface of a far more dangerous power struggle. Across the corridor, Prince William abruptly cancelled 2 state briefings and demanded an immediate private briefing with his father. The heir to the throne recognized the unmistakable signs of a palace coup. Beneath the official decree lay a second classified document, a secret memorandum the palace fiercely refused to publish. Anne vowed she would not publicly assume consort authority until she knew exactly what Camilla had done in the shadows, and why the king had waited until this dark morning to strike. A subtle network of ambitious advisors had sought to usurp sovereign power from within the Queen's private office, pushing the king to an impossible choice between love and the survival of the realm. The illusion of unity was shattered, exposing a monarchy at war with itself. The roots of this systemic collapse did not begin with the morning declaration, but 3 weeks earlier, within the cold, cavernous corridors of Windsor Castle. What was intended to be a meticulously controlled ceremony of royal continuity became the exact threshold where an invisible line was crossed, a moment from which there was no return. The annual royal service of continuity required senior members of the sovereign's family to execute a symbolic pledge defining their constitutional duties during the king's reign. The order of appearance was not mere courtly decoration. It was the rigid framework of royal precedence, deciding where individuals stood, sat, and appeared before the eyes of the nation. Minutes before the service commenced, Princess Anne approached the ceremonial chamber, her keen eyes catching a subtle deviation on the gilded table. Lifting a revised seating card, she studied the embossed ink without speaking a word, her expression turning into carved stone before turning to ask the waiting official who had authorized her name to be demoted beneath the Queen Consort's private circle. Before the terrified palace official could answer, Camilla stepped into the adjoining corridor, drawing the Princess Royal away from the gathering courtiers. Her voice was sharp, desperate, and laced with unspoken panic as she insisted that the crown could not function if the king's wife remained positioned beneath his sister in the final order of precedence. Camilla argued that her office required visible authority if palace staff were expected to obey her directives in an increasingly volatile political climate. Anne did not raise her voice. Her stillness was far more lethal. She looked directly into Camilla's eyes and delivered a chilling truth. Formal precedence was not a reward for personal acceptance, but an iron discipline designed to protect the sovereign structure. Changing the order without written royal assent crossed a dangerous boundary. It allowed a consort's private household to speak as though it carried the weight of the sovereign voice. The argument was severed by the sudden arrival of King Charles. Taking in the tense silence and the altered ceremonial folder, the king's hand trembled slightly as he opened the document, found the illicitly replaced page, and tore it free with a sharp, echoing snap. Ordering the original seating arrangement restored instantly, he pulled his wife into a private alcove. When Camilla bitterly accused him of weakening her authority before the entire court, Charles replied with cold, devastating clarity. She had not been weakened by him, but had destroyed her own standing by issuing a royal command in his name without permission. By nightfall, the keeper of the privy records submitted an explosive breach memorandum directly to the king. An internal report documented conduct that threatened fundamental royal procedure. The Windsor incident was merely the visible tip of an underground empire being built within the palace walls. The secret memorandum revealed that 3 prior instructions had been issued from Camilla's private desk, redirecting staff appointments, patronage announcements, and executive access privileges toward her personal advisors. When Prince William reviewed the file, he realized the Queen Consort's private secretary had systematically intercepted state communications meant for the sovereign. Anne urged her brother to execute a quiet, private correction to avoid public disgrace, but the damage was irreversible. The altered Windsor document had already reached senior government ministers. Silence was no longer a shield, but an admission of helplessness. The sovereign summoned Camilla for a final, terrifying confrontation in his private study. No cameras were present, no secretaries stood by, and no rehearsed smiles protected the participants. Charles stood behind his desk, the Windsor memorandum lying open before him like an indictment. Near the fireplace stood Princess Anne, not as a rival, but as the silent, unyielding witness Camilla least wished to face. For several excruciating seconds, the only sound was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock. Charles pushed the torn ceremony page across the polished mahogany and asked a single, quiet question. "Did you authorize this?" Camilla admitted it, claiming she had acted solely to preserve the institutional authority expected of his wife. Anne stepped forward, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "Respect cannot be manufactured by moving names across a page," she stated coldly, warning that sovereign authority could never be borrowed through marriage. Driven to a corner, Camilla turned on the Princess Royal with sudden fury, accusing Anne of engineering a secret alliance with Prince William designed to manipulate and isolate Charles whenever his health or emotions wavered. The accusation struck the room like a physical blow. Infuriated, the king struck his heavy oak desk once with his palm, the violent crack shattering the silence and shocking both women into total stillness. Charles declared that neither his wife nor his sister would ever speak as though he had surrendered command of his own crown. Opening another dark leather folder, he revealed 3 more directives bearing Camilla's signature, unauthorized proposals to replace senior household officers with her loyalists. Every draft, every secret command, and every altered order pointed to a terrifying reality. The consort's office had attempted to construct an alternative seat of power within the monarchy. The suffocating atmosphere inside the king's study reached its absolute boiling point with the quiet, unannounced entrance of Prince William. He carried no dramatic proclamation, only a thin, dark folder bearing the red wax seal of the office of the Prince of Wales, yet its arrival transformed the private room into an uncompromising tribunal. As heir to the throne, William held constitutional responsibility for planning the future royal household, the vital framework governing the transition to the next reign. Camilla watched in breathless dread as he placed the folder on the mahogany desk beside the unsigned removal order. For the first time that morning, her bitter defiance dissolved into raw, paralyzing fear. Someone had pushed the dangerous gamble far beyond palace intrigue. William opened the file with terrifying composure, revealing that behind the monarch's back, a rogue network had attempted to alter the succession itself. The documents within laid bare a systematic usurpation of authority. Clause by clause, Camilla's secret advisors had attempted to secure permanent institutional powers that would extend far beyond the current reign. The altered transition framework would have granted the Queen Consort's private office continuing influence over royal residences, permanent access to restricted state archives, and direct authority over selected charitable funds during William's future rule. It treated the heir's future reign not as a sacred trust, but as territory to be divided before he had even inherited responsibility for the realm. Camilla stared at the draft in horror, demanding that her private secretary be summoned to account for the treasonous text. The tremor in her voice exposed a devastating truth. In her desperate quest to insulate herself against future exclusion, she had allowed ambitious aides to orchestrate a shadow coup that now destroyed her completely. Princess Anne stepped closer to the desk, her sharp eyes instantly identifying the signature of a senior court advisor she had previously warned the king against. This official had spent months building competing channels of influence, exploiting Camilla's deep insecurities to undermine the sovereign voice. William remained entirely controlled, but the emotional ache beneath his quiet words cut through the room like cold steel. Pushing the file toward his father, the Prince of Wales delivered the ultimate ultimatum. Are you deciding under emotional pressure as a husband, or are you acting as sovereign and accepting ultimate responsibility for the monarchy? King Charles sat motionless, closed his eyes, and slowly removed his spectacles. In that agonized silence, the monarch confessed that his protective devotion to his wife had blinded him to the empire of ambition taking root within her household. The balance of power shifted forever in that single, breathless moment. Reaching for the gold fountain pen, Charles felt the crushing weight of his coronation oath extinguish his personal loyalty. With a slow, deliberate stroke, his signature sealed the decree. Camilla's position as Queen Consort was revoked with immediate effect, and Princess Anne was appointed to take her place beside the throne. Anne placed her hand over the order, demanding immediate written limits on her own temporary powers before accepting the emergency obligation, ensuring that unchecked influence would never again endanger the crown. Camilla watched the black ink settle into the parchment, her hope suffering a complete and total collapse. Decades of political maneuvers, public endurance, and hard-won acceptance vanished in an instant, sacrificed on the altar of royal survival. Before Camilla could leave the room, the relentless machinery of royal erasure was activated. Power in the monarchy does not evaporate through shouting. It disappears through altered schedules, confiscated pass cards, and doors that no longer open.
An official entered carrying a velvet tray, requesting the consort insignia and the primary access card that controlled entry to private state briefings.
Camilla's hand tightened around the card, the token Charles had presented to her on the morning of their coronation. Looking to her husband for salvation, she met only his hollow gaze as he whispered that the card represented an office, not their marriage. Surrendering the artifact, she felt the finality of her ruin as aides outside systematically removed her nameplate from the palace corridors. Her shadow reign had ended, replaced by the unyielding triumph of institutional discipline. Hours after the palace split their official worlds, Princess Anne crossed the quiet corridor alone to discover whether anything personal could survive what the crown had done. She entered without aides, security guards, or ceremonial insignia. Camilla sat beside an untouched cup of tea, still dressed in the outfit chosen for an official engagement she would never attend. For the first time in decades, neither woman had an advisor present to cushion the impact of their words. Anne closed the heavy oak door and remained standing near the entryway. Camilla looked up with quiet bitterness, asking if the Princess Royal had come to inspect what remained of her life. Anne answered simply that she had come because, while the crown had spoken, the family had not. Reaffirming her position, Anne stated that she had never sought the consort rule and would hold it only as long as institutional stability required. She then placed Camilla's unfinished speech, recued from the briefing office, upon the table, noting that losing sovereign authority did not give the palace permission to erase her human dignity. Camilla's composure shattered. She admitted authorizing the seating revision at Windsor, explaining that acute fear had followed her into every room since the coronation. After decades of enduring public rejection as an outsider, every limit placed upon her office felt like proof that the institution still expected her to disappear. Anne listened attentively, but refused to concede the central point. While fear explained her desperation, it could never justify using the king's sovereign authority without permission. When Camilla unpinned the royal diamond brooch from her dress and offered it across the table, Anne gently declined to take it. The insignia belonged to the crown and must be surrendered formally through protocol, not passed between wounded relatives. Before Anne departed, Camilla made one final, tearful plea: to protect Charles from the devastating loneliness his decision would bring. The Princess Royal replied that she would protect the monarch, but Camilla herself must decide if she could still protect the man. By late afternoon, the private tragedy had spilled across the globe. National broadcasters interrupted regular television programming with urgent chimes, while crowds began assembling under steady rainfall outside Buckingham Palace. Hundreds stood beneath black umbrellas, listening silently as news anchor voices echoed from phone screens. Across the capital, newspaper printing presses tore down front pages to print stark black and gold editions beneath the commanding headline, "The King Chooses Duty." Yet one striking scene captured the nation's torn conscience more vividly than any commentary. Outside the palace gates, two women stood silently side by side in the rain, holding hand-painted signs defending opposite sides, one pleading for Camilla's years of service, the other hailing Anne's unwavering discipline. Inside her private quarters, Camilla watched the news in solitude until a commentator described her removal as an inevitable historical correction. Unable to watch strangers reduce decades of struggle and acceptance to a single sentence, she turned off the screen and sat in the cold twilight. The following morning, the new reality assumed its formal shape. King Charles entered the national service at the cathedral, with Princess Anne walking steadfastly beside him, not as a triumphant replacement, but as the sister taking up a burden he could no longer carry alone. Camilla was absent, watching the broadcast privately from her residence, with her unfinished speech resting beside her. Grief remained sharp and humiliating, yet beneath it, a strange sense of relief began to surface. The palace machinery had halted the internal war before political ambition completely consumed their marriage. For the first time, she understood that surrendering the office was the only way to preserve what remained of their bond. At the cathedral entrance, Charles hesitated for a brief second, his hands trembling as he straightened his attire. Anne offered her arm with quiet, stoic grace, reminding the watching world that she stood there to steady her brother, not to usurp his command. Later that afternoon, Charles visited Camilla without aides, leaving his royal briefing folders outside the room to signal that he entered as a husband rather than the sovereign who had stripped her title. In that quiet room, both accepted their shared guilt. Camilla admitted to approving directives she had not fully examined out of fear, while Charles confessed that his reluctance to challenge her earlier had allowed ambitious court advisors to build competing channels of power. Meanwhile, the formal palace investigation cleared junior staff, while dismissing the rogue advisors responsible for the altered transition framework. Anne officially assumed consort duties under strict, published constitutional limits that barred her from interfering in succession planning or household appointments. And so, the palace declaration entered history not as Anne's victory or Camilla's defeat, but as the morning the crown chose unyielding responsibility over personal comfort. In a world where power is fleeting and history is written in silence, the monarchy survived because no individual was permitted to stand above the institution itself. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.